In the last live stream, among other things, I brought up the idea that ultimately, all paths lead the individual to illumination. Afterwards, a member of the semicircle asked me how I reconcile that with a belief in free will. And to me, this confusion is understandable. If, no matter what path we choose, we're inevitably led to the same endpoint, then this seems to imply that free will is an illusion. I'm sure he's not the only one who finds these two doctrines difficult to resolve. My simple answer is that the apparent contradiction is resolved when we understand that the ultimate destination that all roads lead to is simply your own true self. So when I say that all paths lead to illumination, I'm only saying that every choice you make in life ultimately leads you towards self-knowledge. Your true self is the one, or the all. It's all you. There's nothing else. There's nowhere else to go. In truth, you're there already. Separation is an illusion. Therefore, the path of return is ultimately an illusion, although you may say that it's a necessary illusion. The false egoic self experiences itself as separate from the universal mind, or the true self. In the Christian system, a lost soul, or an unsaved person, is understood to be spiritually dead in sin. And death, in the Christian system, is understood to mean separation from God. In the Christian system, death enters the world through sin, and sin is understood to mean something like missing the mark. To sin is to be a little off in your aim. Instead of knowing the truth and perceiving reality as it is, or perceiving yourself as you are, you fall under an illusion. Your perception is a little bit off, or possibly even way off. Really, it doesn't matter, because to miss the target by an inch is to miss it by a mile. When you're solving a math problem, whether you simply forgot to carry the 1, whether you put the decimal in the wrong place, or whether you made a huge error early on in your calculations and ended up being way off, your answer is wrong. If you attempt to jump across a canyon, it doesn't matter how close you came to landing safely on the other side, whether you just barely miss, or whether you miss it by several feet. Either way, you fall to your death on the rocks below. So in the Christian system, there's the idea that in an ultimate sense, no sin is greater than any other sin. One sinner is no worse than any other sinner. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, as the Bible verse says. When I talk about the Christian system, I trust that those listening will understand that I'm talking about the Christian system from a Gnostic or mystical perspective. Although most of what I'm saying is consistent with what's taught in mainstream Christian churches, they just understand these doctrines in a more literal sense. And it may seem to some that I'm wandering off topic, but I assure you that the road I'm going down will ultimately lead back to the main topic, as every road inevitably does. But it's important to understand the problem. It's impossible to talk about the meaning of repentance and redemption without first understanding the meaning of sin. To sin is to miss the mark. To sin is to fall into error, or to fall from reality into illusion. To repent is to turn back toward the truth. To repent is to adjust your aim. And it's my view that this adjustment is accomplished by degrees. I believe in enlightenment by degrees. I believe in sudden enlightenment as well. If you're familiar with the various schools of Buddhist thought, you may be familiar with the Soto school versus the Rinzai school. I consider both to be valid. Here's how I reconcile the two. If you think of a light switch, it's either turned on or off. There's no in between. This is the Rinzai school of sudden enlightenment. And so the style of teaching tends to be somewhat shocking. The goal of the teacher is to wake the student by shaking them violently. And you'll find this approach to teaching gnosis within the Gnostic tradition. A lot of the Gnostic teachings and symbols are jarring, and they're intended to be. The Gnostics often used the technique of completely inverting the meaning of symbols. For example, the Abrahamic deity becomes the evil demiurge. What you thought was God is suddenly unmasked as the devil. The world is instantly turned upside down, and you're dislocated. The illusion is shattered like a stained glass window, and your eyes instantly perceive the world as it is, through the broken window that distorted and discolored your vision only an instant before. For some people, this more sudden and violent approach works. For many others, a more gradual approach is needed. In the Buddhist tradition, this is the Soto school of gradual enlightenment. You'll find this in the Gnostic tradition too, and in the various Western mystery schools with their complicated degree structures. Sudden enlightenment can be blinding. If your eyes are accustomed to darkness, and someone suddenly flips the light switch or pulls back the curtain, your reaction will be to close your eyes tightly and turn your head away from the light. It's painful. You will have to give your eyes time to adjust. So even with sudden enlightenment, there will be a process of adjustment. Even sudden enlightenment is really another method of gradual enlightenment then, and it's a very harsh and abrupt one. So why not simply adopt the gradual method? Well, because some people need that loud alarm clock to get them out of bed in the morning. But it's also true that gradual enlightenment is really sudden enlightenment. If instead of an on-off light switch, you think of a dimmer switch, there is still a very precise point at which the light comes on. The light bulb is either on or off. There's no in between. If it's on, then the brightness can be adjusted. But even if it's turned down very dim, it's still on. And it's either on or it isn't. The nice thing about a dimmer switch is that you can adjust it as your eyes adjust. But whether you use a dimmer switch or an on-off switch, the light is either on or off. And whichever switch you use, your eyes will have to adjust to the light. So I think when we look at it in this way, we can see that the difference between the gradual school and the sudden school is really just a difference in teaching styles. Both methods lead to the attainment of the same goal. And of course, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna explains 3 different paths of yoga. Some yogis talk about 4 different kinds of yoga, and every spiritual path or religion can be seen as belonging to one of these 3 or 4 categories of yoga. And really, most major religions offer all 3 or 4. Within the Christian tradition, many practitioners follow the path of devotion. They worship God through the image of Christ. For them, Christianity is a personal relationship with Jesus, and I consider this to be a valid path. And I believe it ultimately leads to gnosis. Even though Christians who attain gnosis via this path may not call themselves Gnostics or describe their spiritual practice as bhakti yoga. Other Christians practice karma yoga or follow the path of action. They become Christ by becoming his hands and feet, as some say. And these paths are not mutually exclusive. Very often, it is a person's feelings of devotion that inspire their actions or their life of service. You might almost consider bhakti yoga and karma yoga to be complementary parts of the same path. Of course, the great philosopher Shankara and others within the Vedanta tradition consider the path of knowledge to be superior. And the path of knowledge is obviously the primary form of yoga we find in the Gnostic, Pythagorean, and Neoplatonic traditions. And because many of these streams within the Western tradition have dried up, so to speak, I believe there's value in studying the living tradition of Vedanta or Zen Buddhism. I've personally gained a great deal of insight into Gnosticism and Pythagoreanism by studying and practicing Vedanta Yoga and Zen Buddhism, as well as Taoism. The fourth path of yoga is the path of meditation. This is the path we find emphasized in Zen, but meditation is certainly an important part of Gnosticism and Pythagoreanism as well. This is considered by many to be the most direct path to enlightenment or gnosis. And some have underemphasized the importance of daily meditation within the Pythagorean tradition, and overemphasized the importance of intellectual study. In the Golden Verses of Pythagoras, after outlining instructions for daily meditation practice, it goes on to say essentially that through this practice, all things will be revealed to you, and you will become an immortal God. So the Pythagorean school, although it definitely promotes intellectual development and the path of knowledge, seems to consider the path of meditation as ultimately more important to the goal of philosophic illumination. In the end, the ultimate truth that is revealed to the philosopher who arrives at the end of philosophy is a truth that transcends the intellectual understanding of the rational mind. Gnosis isn't a conceptual knowledge, but an experiential knowledge. It is a direct knowledge of the One that can only be achieved through union with the One. And this union can be achieved through the path of devotion, the path of action, the path of knowledge, or the path of meditation. And each of these paths can be found within each of the major religions, including atheism and materialism, as I explain in my video, Atheism as a Path to God and Spiritual Illumination. Even the path of sin ultimately leads to redemption. Earlier, I talked about the apparent contradiction between the doctrine of free will and the doctrine of universalism. By universalism, I mean the doctrine that ultimately everyone is redeemed. If you think, like most Christians do, that a person is granted only one lifetime, after which he faces judgment, then this will seem like an absurd doctrine. If you point to any random person, the odds are that he will not attain the knowledge of his true self or enter into a state of union with the divine within his current lifetime. But if you accept the doctrine of metempsychosis, or reincarnation, then this is not the end of the world for him. He'll have many more chances, and eventually he will become enlightened. Eventually, he will know himself. And once he reaches the end of his soul's long journey across many lifetimes, it will become clear to him that every situation he experienced and every decision he made in each of those lifetimes ultimately led him to the realization and actualization of his true self. In the Christian tradition, there's the saying that a tree produces fruit according to its own nature. A good tree produces good fruit. An apple seed can only grow into an apple tree. You can only ever become what you already are. And according to the esoteric philosophy, your true self is the One, or the All. Nothing exists apart from God. It's all you. You are it. The false self, which you've become identified with, is an illusion. It doesn't exist. It isn't real. The only thing that is real, the only thing that does exist, is your true self. It's all that ever was, all that is, and all that will ever be. There's nothing else to become. There's nowhere else to go. And so it's inevitable that you'll arrive there, because there is the only place there is. In fact, you're already there. You never really left. When you wake up from a dream, you realize that you were right there in your bed the whole time. Every dream, you might say, inevitably leads you back to where you were when you fell asleep. But this doesn't make the dream meaningless. Everything you experienced in the dream was very real, in a sense. I believe there's a reason why we dream. If dreaming were unnecessary, then we wouldn't have dreams. And if the journey of our soul through multiple incarnations in the material world of illusion were unnecessary, then the universal mind wouldn't generate the cosmic dream of the material space-time universe which we mistake for reality. But as to the question of free will, it seems to me that we act with free will within dreams, at least to varying degrees. It's true that inevitably the end of the dream will lead to us waking up and finding ourselves back in bed, realizing that it was all a dream, and remembering who we really are. But that doesn't imply that we weren't free to make different choices within the dream. Of course, we can think in terms of there being lower and higher levels of consciousness, even within a dream. Obviously, our experiences within the dream world are mostly generated by the unconscious mind. The dream world we find ourselves sort of imprisoned within is the creation of the unconscious, just as in the Gnostic system, the material world of illusion we find our spirits imprisoned within is the creation of the ignorant demiurge, as below, so above. So when we're less conscious, many of the choices we make, which we believe to be the result of our own free will, are actually generated by the same unconscious mental force that is generating the dream, or the material universe. On the other end of the consciousness spectrum, we have the phenomenon of lucid dreaming. In a lucid dream, the dreamer becomes aware that he's inside of a dream. In the same way a Gnostic, or a Buddha, becomes aware that the world he mistook for reality is actually a kind of dream or illusion. He becomes aware that what he mistook for his true self is actually just a part of the dream. He now realizes his true self is the dreamer. And so he understands that even though whatever happens in the dream seems as though it's happening to him, in reality, he's the one doing it. He may not understand why he's doing it, but everything that happens according to his true will. And in the same way, everything that happens according to the divine will. So why does evil exist? Why is there suffering in the world? I believe the answer to this is very much like the answer to the question, why do we have nightmares? For the idealist, metaphysical questions are psychological questions. I'll leave you to study the question of nightmares for yourself, and as you do, I encourage you to consider how this relates to the question of evil and suffering in the world. But I'll suggest that, among other things perhaps, nightmares serve to bring us into a confrontation with the shadow. The path of individuation requires us to confront and integrate the shadow. And I believe the path of illumination and apotheosis requires God, who is incarnate in each of us, to go through a similar process of shadow integration. I explored this idea more fully in other videos related to the demiurge, but I'll touch on some of the major themes again here, because it may not seem like it to some, but these themes are very relevant to the main topic. In my view, knowing what a thing is also means knowing what a thing is not. If someone asks you to define any word, you'll attempt to explain the word to him by giving him synonyms and antonyms. If I ask you what the word intelligent means, you might tell me that it's another word for smart, and that it's the opposite of stupid, for example. And it also seems to me that the formation of a self-concept entails the formation of a concept of the not-self. To know reality, it seems that some kind of concept of the unreal has to be formed. But of course, the unreal isn't real, but it exists as a concept within the mind. Nothing exists apart from the all. Nothing exists except for the one. There's only the universal mind, or God. But the desire for self-knowledge on the part of the one can be thought of as giving birth to a self-concept, which we might think of as the sun. The sun is the image of the Father. But of course, the idea of a begotten Son implies the idea of an unbegotten Son. And in Gnostic Christianity, it's significant that both Jesus and the Demiurge are born of virgins. Both are born to a virgin without a male consort. But I don't want to delve too deeply into the mystery of the virgin birth here. The important thing to note here is related to a Gnostic interpretation of the Gospel of John. In the first chapter, it's made clear that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. The Son is co-eternal with the Father. They are two, and yet one. The Son is the Father. This is the mystery of the self-begotten One. The Word, or the Logos, is identified with Christ, obviously, and we can associate the Christ principle with consciousness, or spirit. But surely the Christ concept implies an anti-Christ concept. This is the Demiurge. The Demiurge is the concept of the not Logos. We might call him chaos. If Christ is consciousness, then the Demiurge is unconsciousness. If Christ is the spiritual principle, then the Demiurge is the material principle. If Christ reveals the light to men, then the Demiurge wishes to keep men in darkness. If Christ is like a doorway that leads us into union with the Father, then the Demiurge is like a solid brick wall that obstructs our path and separates us from the Father, telling us there is no God but me. The first chapter of John goes on to say that through the Word, or the Logos, everything was made, and that without him, nothing was made that was made. For literalists, this seems to be equating the Logos with the Demiurge, but I think this is wrong. For Gnostics, Christ, or Lucifer, is certainly not identical with the Demiurge, or Satan. The Gospel of Judas makes it explicitly clear that they are not the same. For me, the key to understanding this confusing passage is found in the recognition that the material world doesn't exist. It isn't real. It's an illusion. So when verse 3 says that all things were made through him, it's talking about the higher spiritual realms. It isn't talking about the lower material realm of the Demiurge. The secret book of John tells us that Sophia gave birth to the Demiurge without her male consort. Her male consort is Christ, or Lucifer. And so the third verse of the first chapter of John refers to this obliquely when it says that without him, or without the Logos, nothing was made that was made. In other words, the material world, which is the creation of the Demiurge, doesn't exist. Everything that exists, in other words, the higher spiritual realms, was created through the begotten Son of the Father. Without him, nothing was made. What we call the material world is nothing. It doesn't exist. It's an illusion. The Demiurge, by implication, also doesn't exist, since he was made without the Logos. Without the Logos, nothing was made that was made. The Demiurge is an illusion, then. He can be compared to the ego. Spiritual teachers of virtually every school agree that the egoic self is a false self. It's an illusion. The Demiurge is like this. It is a false self that exists within the universal mind as a concept of what the true self is not. But only the true self exists. But the process of divine self-knowledge requires the formation of a concept of not self as a necessary condition for the creation of a perfect self-concept. So we have the only begotten Son, the Christ, the perfect spiritual Adam, or Lucifer, as the visible image or representation of the invisible Father. And we have the unbegotten Son, the bastard son, the demiurge, or Satan, which is a kind of negation of the true self. And in the myth of Sophia, this bastard son is described as a stillbirth, or as an abortion. This is to indicate that, in a sense, he doesn't actually exist. He isn't alive. He has no spirit. These are some of my thoughts related to the nature of the demiurge. And I think it's necessary to consider the Gnostic view of the demiurge and the esoteric doctrine that the material world is an illusion and that the One is your true self. Because without this understanding, it's easy to see the doctrine of free will as contradicting the doctrine of universalism. This is very different from the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. For the Calvinist, God is separate from you. So if everything happens according to God's will, then it seems difficult to argue that men have free will. And even many Protestants reject the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. It's just difficult for many people to wrap their heads around the idea of a good and loving God who predestines some for eternal salvation and others for eternal damnation. It seems very immoral to send a soul to hell for eternity when that soul really had no choice to accept or reject God. I've heard hardline Calvinists try to defend the morality of the doctrine of predestination, but never successfully as far as I'm concerned. Unlike Calvinists, Universalists believe that ultimately everyone is saved. Somehow everyone is redeemed, and everyone goes to heaven. This sounds more moral on the surface, but if you think about it, it still seems wrong somehow. Whether God chooses to send you to hell, or whether God chooses to send you to heaven, either way, you've not been given the choice. You are not free. If everything happens according to God's will, and you are not God, then you have no free will. It's that simple. There's no way to reconcile universalism with free will if you are not God. But if you are God, then the conflict is resolved. Everything happens according to divine will, but you yourself are divine. So this means that everything happens according to your will. And when I say that every path ultimately leads you to illumination, this doesn't mean that you have no choice. It doesn't mean that you have no free will. You've already made the choice. You chose to experience yourself as separate from your true self, so that you can experience other fragmented aspects of your true self as other. In this way, friendship and love are made possible. The trade-off is that the possibility of having friends comes with the possibility of having enemies. The possibility of loving and being loved comes with the possibility of hating and being hated. But you accepted this. You decided it was worth it. You chose to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You chose to experience pleasure and pain. You chose the path of illumination. It's inevitable that you will become illuminated because this is your true will, and everything happens according to your true will. So in a sense, you might think of everything as being determined, but you are the one who determined it. So in the esoteric view, there's no contradiction between determinism and free will. But of course, I only say that everything happens according to your true will. Your true will is the will of your true self. To the extent that you identify with the false self, you will feel that things are happening to you, often against your will. That is to say, against the false will of the false self. This is why teachers like Buddha or Pythagoras teach a kind of stoic attitude. They teach their students to accept what is, because by doing so, They are reorienting themselves to be in alignment with their true will. This is part of coming to know and identify with the true self. You can't achieve wholeness by being at war with yourself. You can't achieve union with the divine by being at war with the divine will, which is really your own true will. In the golden verses of Pythagoras, it says, "Concerning all the calamities that men suffer by divine fortune, support with patience thy lot, be it what it may, and never repine at it, but endeavor what thou canst to remedy it." So although the Pythagorean philosophy is very stoic in a sense, it doesn't involve passive acceptance. Someone who wants to attack the Pythagorean philosophy will ask, so what are you saying? That a woman who's being raped accept being raped? Or that people who live under the rule of a tyrannical regime should just accept it? No, of course not. The Pythagorean teaching is that you should do what you can to remedy it. And there's no conflict here. If the nature of the true self is limitless, and if freedom is its natural state, then the true will is toward freedom. And the concept of freedom, or limitlessness, implies the opposite concept of restriction or limitation. Many schools of thought within both the Western and Eastern esoteric traditions teach the view that essentially the omniscient being chose to temporarily enter into a state of ignorance in order to experience the pleasure of seeking and attaining wisdom. To me, it seems consistent with this sort of logic to say that the limitless being chose to temporarily enter into conditions of limitation in order to experience the joy of overcoming those limitations. You might say that tyranny exists in order that men might have the experience of resisting tyranny and striving toward freedom. Some may think that accepting what is means inaction, but this isn't the Pythagorean view. Accepting your lot in life, accepting your fate, or accepting your karma also involves accepting your role as an active participant in life. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna doesn't advise Arjuna not to fight. Krishna says, enter into the battle, but remain detached. Act, but let go of the fruits of your actions. In the same way, the samurai would enter into battle without thought of victory or defeat. This doesn't mean that they were passive. They were fully engaged in the battle. But they mentally accepted the outcome, whether the battle ended in victory or defeat. And it shouldn't surprise us to find that Pythagoras embraced this sort of warrior ethos. According to him, he was a great warrior in the Trojan Wars. This particular past life seems to have had special significance for him. And I believe that even in his life as a philosopher and teacher, he still identified strongly with the warrior spirit. So accepting your lot in life doesn't mean being passive. It doesn't mean not fighting battles. Quite the opposite. Accepting your lot in life means accepting your duty to act. It means accepting your role in the unfolding drama. In my view, the concept of karma is often very misunderstood. Some criticize the doctrine of karma by saying that it leads not only to passivity, but also to victim blaming. They think that the belief in karma means that if you were born a slave, then it must just be your karma, and so you should just accept being a slave. This is not my understanding of karma. I think it's better to say that you were born into slavery so that you can come to a knowledge of your true self. Freedom is your true nature. By struggling to become free, you are struggling against the false self and aligning yourself with your true will, which is to be free. Similarly, some think that if you believe in karma, you won't help people who are suffering, because if someone is suffering in this life, it must be their karma. This is not my view, and it isn't the Pythagorean view or the Gnostic view. Someone asked Jesus why a certain blind man was born blind. They asked him whether he thought the man was born blind because of his own sins or because of the sins of his parents. Of course, the idea that the man was born blind because of his own sins implies a belief in karma and reincarnation. Jesus replied that the man's blindness wasn't due to sin on the part of either the man or his parents, but in order that the works of God might be manifest. He does seem to be saying that it was God's will that this man was born blind. But right after he said this, he healed the man. So was Jesus opposing the divine will? No. He said that he only did the will of the Father who sent him. So this seems like a contradiction. Apparently, the story is saying that it was part of the divine will that the man was born blind, and it was part of the divine will that the man be cured of his blindness. It was the man's karma to be born blind, you might say. But the story makes it clear that karma is not about punishment for sins. I'm suggesting that karma is about redemption. Everything that happens to you is ultimately intended to lead you toward illumination. And again, in the Gnostic view, the blind man was God. If this weren't so, it would seem cruel of God to cause this man to be born blind, especially since, according to Jesus, the man hadn't sinned. But in the Gnostic view, God is the blind man's true self. The divine will is the blind man's true will. And so that man ultimately was born blind of his own free will, as shocking as that may sound. So did Jesus violate the man's will by healing him? No. It was the blind man's true will to be born blind, in order that Jesus might heal him. He was born temporarily blind, in order to experience the joy of having his sight restored. What would happen if you adopted this belief? When you meet someone who is depressed, don't assume that they are afflicted with depression as a punishment for their sins in a former life. They're depressed so that you can offer them encouragement. They're sad so that you can comfort them. Is this what Jesus meant in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted"? You might also say, "Blessed are the ignorant, for they shall attain gnosis." Blessed are those who have become separate from the divine, for they shall achieve union with the divine. Clearly, accepting your lot doesn't mean just accepting ignorance. It was your will to be born in a state of ignorance. But this isn't the end goal. You chose to be born in a state of ignorance so that you can experience the ecstasy of enlightenment. Fully accepting the situation also means accepting your role in the situation, which is to seek wisdom. This is your true will. It is irresistible. The Calvinist doctrine of irresistible grace is close to the truth. The will that resists the true will is a false will, and that which is true will always prevail against that which is false in the end. And so yes, all paths ultimately lead you back to your true self. This doesn't mean you don't have free will. You do. It is your true will that ultimately leads you back to your true self. I'll end there. Thanks for listening. Peace.